We're in 2 Samuel. We'll be in chapter 16 to begin with. We're going to kind of backtrack in the life of David to where we were just a few weeks ago. I mentioned this event just sort of in passing in another sermon, and I want to come back and hit it pretty hard today. While we're taking this in-depth study through the life of David, I want you, I'm not just trying to give you historical facts and biographical facts and things like that. I want you to see David as a real person, because he was a real person. And I want you to see the things in his life that made him a man after God's own heart. Why? God is the one that described him that way. And we want to see those things, and then we want to emulate those qualities in our own lives, the qualities that made David a man after God's own heart. So one of those qualities that we're going to talk about today is a forgiving spirit. This attribute is one of the most difficult attributes to acquire. It is not easy to be forgiving. And instead of fully forgiving someone, sometimes we try to do something else. We opt for one of three other options. Instead of complete forgiveness, we offer a conditional forgiveness. Well, I'll forgive you if you do this. Or, I will forgive you as soon as you understand what I'm saying. We make it conditional. If you admit you're part of the problem, then I'll forgive you. Until that happens, I'm not going to do it. Well, that's conditional forgiveness. That's conditional. And it says, I'm waiting, you make your move, and then I'll decide if I want to pounce on you or back away and leave you alone. The second kind of forgiveness that is less than perfect is partial forgiveness. Well, I'll forgive you, but I guarantee I'm not going to forget this. How many of you heard that or have said it yourself? Oh, I'll forgive you, but just get out of here and leave me alone right now. Some people, in fact, will forgive us, or they'll say they forgive you just so they don't have to deal with us anymore. But that's true, is it not? That's true. A third response is delayed forgiveness. I'll forgive you, but just give me some time. I'll eventually get over it, then I'll forgive you one of these days, but not right now. That's a very common response to someone who has been deeply hurt and they have been nursing that hurt over the months or years or whatever it may be. Most of us would rather sit on the judgment seat than on the mercy seat. Am I right? We would much rather do that. If somebody did us wrong, we want payback. Well, forgiveness isn't all about the other person, it's about us. When we are unforgiving, it has a dramatic downward effect on our lives. It pulls us down. It starts with the offense, and then if we don't forgive right at the offense, then resentment will build up against that person. And if there isn't forgiveness there, then hatred will begin to take the place of resentment. And then a grudge, and ultimately that leads to revenge. I'm going to pay him or her back. I'm just biding my time until I can do that. Well, confession time. It's not easy for me to preach a sermon like this because it is so convicting. God has dealt with me about these very things in the past couple of years, actually. He has dealt with me, and I think today that I can honestly say that there is not a soul that I have not forgiven. I believe I can say that, but I'm not saying that to brag. I have absolutely no sense of pride as I say that. I'm trying to say this in thankfulness and humility, to say, to honestly encourage you that it can be done. It can be done. But very honestly, it is not easy. And it's a struggle. Let me go a little bit further and say this. while I don't feel resentment toward anyone, I still struggle with these things. And I have to deal with not letting that offense linger and not letting it build on up to resentment or anything worse. If I don't deal with it at the offense, I'm a goner. And so, I want you to understand where I'm coming from. So we're going to look at forgiveness in the life of David. This is a great place to do it in 2 Samuel chapter 16. We saw just in the past few weeks that David had come to the very lowest point of his life, a very low ebb. He's never been lower. In fact, it could be compared to the time when he was running from Saul. For all of those years, he's running for Saul. This was back before he became king. Saul was hunting him down to take his life. But now, today, he is even lower than he was then. So remember, David's sin with Bathsheba had set off a chain reaction. Terrible things had happened. The prophet Nathan confronted David, and he said, "Your baby will die." And that happened. And then he said, "Your wives will be taken advantage of in public." And that happened. And then he said, "Your family will turn against you." And for crying out loud, that happened as well. His own son, David's own son Absalom, had conspired against him and had stolen the throne from him. And now Absalom is claiming to be king. And David is running for his life from his own son, who is trying to take his life. He is at rock bottom. And it may be at this very moment that he wrote the words to Psalm 40. Verses 1 and 2 and 12 say this: "I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. The troubles without number surround me. My sins have overtaken me. I cannot see. There are more than the hairs of my head, and my heart fails within me." This is a low spot in David's life. It may very well be that he wrote those words during this time. He was in the pit of despair. Any of you, I lost the name of the movie, Princess Bride fans. He was in the pit of despair. Have you ever felt like that? All of us have, I'm sure, at some point. At a desperate moment with guilt crashing in on top of David, a guy named Shimei shows up out of nowhere and just pours salt in the wound, just adds to his misery. It is a terrible place to be. Last Sunday night, in the service, we went back to David again, and I talked about the people that Scripture, a poet described as sheltering trees to David. They were friends who sheltered him from the storms and sheltered him from the blistering sun and heat. And I described several of those. And in fact, I'll finish that sermon. It was a long one. I'll finish that sermon not next Sunday night, but the following Sunday night, June the 11th. But let me tell you, Shimei was no sheltering tree. To be very blunt, this guy is a jerk. He is just a jerk. He is a real loser. Look in 2 Samuel chapter 16, beginning in verse 5. I'm going to read a lot of Scripture. Follow with me in your Bible if you would. "As King David approached Bahurim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family came out from there. His name was Shimei, son of Gera. He cursed as he came out. He pelted David and all the king's officials with stones." So he's chunking rocks at them. though all the troops and the special guard were on David's right and left. As he cursed, Shimei said, now he's speaking to the king, "Get out! Get out, you murderer! You scoundrel! The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has given the kingdom into the hands of your son Absalom, and you have come to ruin because you are a murderer." Now, Shimei was your basic reprobate. All right? He was the kind of guy that kicks you when you're down. And when you're at the very lowest point, I mean the ultimate low spot, Shimei comes along and stomps the back of your head and mashes your face into the mud. That's the kind of guy he is. And then when you squirm, he's got another punch coming or another kick coming. Well, then along comes someone else to give David counsel. Verse 9, chapter 16. Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head." Now that is a pretty direct approach, isn't it? The kind of guy that gets the job done. He says, "Listen, let me take care of him. I'll slice his throat so fast he won't know it until he sneezes. I will get rid of this guy." You've got, all of us have somebody in our lives that are that way. Hey, let me take care of him. You don't have to take that stuff. You stand up. You've got rights. Stand up for yourself. Don't let him walk all over you. Just cut him off at the knees. Sue that guy. Does that sound familiar to anybody? You've heard that kind of stuff from people before. Well, Shimei had come to David at a very hard moment, a very difficult time where he is in shame running from his own son. And Shimei has not only thrown rocks at him, but he is hurling insults at him, and he's also spreading lies about David. And David has done nothing to Shimei to warrant this kind of treatment. Nothing at all. But there he is, yelling, cursing, throwing rocks at David and his men. And David now has a choice. He can either be offended and become resentful and then take revenge on Shimei, or not. He has a choice. In verse 10, the king said, "What does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah?" Now, if David has said this once in the study of 1st and 2nd Samuel, he said it at least a half a dozen times. The sons of Zeruiah were Joab, Abishai, and Asahel, and they were all built with a very short fuse. These guys carried around a chip on their shoulder. They were always ready to fight. They always wanted to kill somebody. And David refused to retaliate, and it probably made this guy mad. But the rest of verse 10 says, "If he is cursing because the Lord has said to him, 'Curse David,' then who can ask, 'Why do you do this?' If the Lord has told him to do this, who are we to ask, 'Why are you doing this?' It may be that the Lord will look upon my misery and restore to me His covenant blessing instead of His curse today." So do you get the picture? Are you seeing this in your mind? This is an amazing study in self-control when David is at the very rock bottom point in his life. Along comes Shimei, who kicks him while he's down. But instead of fighting back, David says, "Hey, guys, the Lord may be in this." Wow. What an attitude to have. He didn't get offended. He didn't take it personally. He didn't yell back at the guy. He didn't throw rocks. How in the world could David do this? Well, I'll tell you, David had a soft heart and very thick skin. That's the ticket, just plain and simple. Not sensitive skin, but thick skin. I'm talking rhinoceros thick skin. All right? The kind that lets you get punched around and still come back. Let me tell you what, if you ever hope to be used by God, you need to develop a layer of that kind of skin. Because you can count on it, Shimei's are out there by the dozens. They are everywhere. And people who get the job done are those who are able to look they are those who are able to overlook all sorts of hurtful comments that others are going to make. When you walk through thorns, you better have on heavy boots. You don't want to go through them barefooted, or you won't get far. And listen, if you're called into leadership in the church or at your job or even at your home, you've got to deal with people, and you better be well shod. You better have good thick boots on, and you better have good armor on. If not, you're doomed for failure. Now, this doesn't mean a thickness toward God, okay? It means that you grow a protective coating on you that sheds the stones and the arrows from other people like Shimei. Now, if you haven't already met up with a Shimei, you're going to. Probably this afternoon, okay? You're going to. These guys seem to multiply, and you'll have to decide, am I going to be offended by his or her comment? Or am I going to be big enough to forgive? Or am I going to not only be offended, am I going to throw rocks back at him? You've got to make that decision. Now, let's jump ahead in the story to chapter 19. We've already covered the in-between. But some time has passed. The rebellious son Absalom has been brutally murdered. And although this is not what David wanted at all, this did get Absalom off of the throne, and the people are turning their hearts back to David. In fact, they're moving him back to Jerusalem after being on a run, and they're in a hurry to get him back there because they want to get the right man back on the throne. So today is a day of coronation. It's a day of celebration, and David has come from the very lowest point in his life back to the mountaintop, back to the throne. And he's rejoicing that he is about to be enthroned as king again. And wouldn't you know it, that jerk Shimei shows up. Take a look, chapter 19, verse 16. Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, hurried down with the men of Judah to meet King David. Now he's coming back home. With them were 1,000 Benjamites, along with Ziba, the steward of Saul's household, and his 15 sons and 20 servants. And they rushed to the Jordan where the king was. They crossed at the ford to take the king's household over to do whatever he wished. Now listen to this. When Shimei, son of Gera, crossed the Jordan, did he throw rocks at David? No. He fell prostrate before the king and said to him, May my lord the king, may my lord not hold me guilty. Do not remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. May the king put it out of his mind, for I, your servant, know I have sinned. But today I have come here as the first from among the tribes of Joseph to come down and to meet my lord the king. What he's saying is, please forgive me, king. Forgive me for the dumb things I did earlier. When Shimei comes up, he says the 3 hardest words to say in the English language. I have sinned. I have sinned. He admitted it. And those 3 words must have resonated in the heart and mind of David, because it hadn't been too many years ago that those very same words came from David's mouth when Nathan the prophet pointed his finger in his face and said, you're the guilty man. David didn't fight back. He didn't retaliate. he admitted, I have sinned. Chuck Swindoll says forgiveness comes easier when we remember in our own past when we failed and were forgiven. It comes much easier when we remember that we have been forgiven. So, before we look at David's response to this, let's look at the other side of the equation and think about the times that might have been when we've been in Shimei's shoes. Let's think about that for just a minute. Shimei is a real person. His actions are real. His reactions are real. And we have all had similar experiences like this, where we've all done or said something that we knew could easily offend someone else, and it did. And we now know that we were wrong to say that or to do that. What do? How do we respond? How do we react? We know that the person is hurt by it. So the ball is in our court. It is our serve. It's our move. It's our chance to settle it. What do? Buck up and say, no, I'm not going to admit I was wrong? Or do we humbly admit, I have sinned. I was wrong. It's even tougher to admit when we know we were 100% wrong when we said the thing or did the thing that hurt that person. Well, that's where Shimei finds himself. Now look at David and his side of the matter. After what Shimei had said to him earlier, just those months earlier, called him a scoundrel and a murderer and all of those things, David could have been indifferent to his confession. David could have just ignored him. And some people will do that, just walk on past with a shrug and pretending not to hear. Well, George Bernard Shaw wrote these wise words. The worst sin toward our fellow creatures is not to hate him, but to be indifferent to them. That is the essence of inhumanity. I think those are true words. Indifference is certainly not forgiveness. Indifference is rage under control. Well, Shimei is spread out on the ground before David saying, I have sinned. What he's saying is, please, King, forgive me. Please forgive me. In verse 21, then Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, said, shouldn't Shimei be put to death for this? He cursed the Lord's anointed. Now, Abishai doesn't tell King David, oh, just ignore him, just go on. He says, no way, David. This guy kicked you when you were down. You go after him, kick him back and kick him hard. He deserves it. Well, but David says in chapter 19, verse 22, what does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? What right do you have to interfere? Should anyone be put to death in Israel today? This is a day of celebration. This is not a day for killing. Don't I know that today I am king over all Israel? So the king said to Shimei down on the ground, you shall not die. And the king promised him on oath. He promised him, you'll be all right. So here's another instance where the sons of Zeruiah are ready to fight and ready to chop off somebody's head with that short fuse, but David isn't swayed by his counsel. David isn't convinced that what he is saying is right. Think about the magnificent, merciful control that David demonstrates. Because he did have the power to punish Shimei. But he had the strength and ability to forgive instead. Now, how could David forgive such a loser like Shimei? How could he forgive such a jerk? Real quickly, two things. First of all, he kept his vertical focus. God, you can handle this. You take care of it. you're good at that. He had a perspective. What would God think? What would God want me to do? I have discovered great strength in when I am offended by someone or hurt by someone, to take it immediately to God. There's something stabilizing about getting God's perspective on a situation before you get the counsel of anyone else. So when you're hurt, take it immediately to God and get that vertical focus. The next thing is that David was very much aware of his own failure. Chuck Swindoll also said, "The humbled forgiven make good forgivers." I like that. The humbled forgiven make good forgivers. David knew well what it meant to be a sinner. He was one and he was good at it. He knew what it meant to be forgiven. He had experienced God's forgiveness time and time again. He knew the heartache of having done wrong. He knew the cleansing feeling that he gets from being forgiven by God. How freeing, how wonderful it is. Remember all those horrible months when he was humbled by God, running from Saul and then running from his own son. Those things had seasoned David and made him merciful and gracious toward others. And being well aware of his own shortcomings gave him the patience to deal with someone else's wrongdoing. I need to hurry. The proud have a hard time forgiving. Those people who don't admit and recognize their own failure have a tough time tolerating failure and wrongdoing in someone else. So if we want to develop a spirit of forgiveness in our lives, which that's what this is all about, if we want to develop a spirit of forgiveness in our lives, we need to emulate the things that David did. Real quickly, let me share 4 things. We need to cultivate a layer of thick skin. Okay? We just need to do that. A thick layer of skin that is a buffer that will catch the darts and the stones that the enemy throws at us. And we need to ask God's help with this. Lord, help me not to be so sensitive. Help me to toughen up. Help me to have a thick hide. Calm my responses. Lord, please give me thicker skin. Make me more like Christ. This will help keep us on balance so the slightest little punch from the enemy doesn't send us toppling over. The next thing is this. We need to try to understand where the offender is coming from. This takes a lot of grace, but again, God is good at grace, right? He's good at that. So try to see where the offender is coming from. Try to see why they are acting that way, why they are responding this way. You might be surprised at how helpful it is. And who knows, David may have seen a bit of his old self in Shimei when the rocks were whizzing by his head. He may have seen, that's the way I used to be, the way I used to act. Sometimes we make things more complicated than they really are. Maybe the critics that come into your life have just been building up and saving up, and then today is the day they're ready to explode on you. It happens all the time, where a guy gets yelled at work, and then he goes home and is mean to his wife, and then she gets angry with the kid. The kid walks out and kicks the cat, and the cat runs around all night trying to find something else to bite. Are we not that way? And it's just a chain reaction that follows when we don't stay calm and act graciously toward others. Now, I'm not saying it's easy or that it comes naturally, but it is not impossible. It is possible for us to treat others that way. And putting ourselves in another person's shoes helps us to understand their reactions. And think about it. Jesus did the very same thing as He's hanging on the cross. And He looks down at His tormentors and He says, Father, forgive them, because they don't really understand what they're doing. that shows us His attitude toward enemies. The third thing is remember the times in your own life when you needed forgiveness. All of us can remember many of them. All of us can remember many of them. We've done dumb things. We've said dumb things. We've hurt people that we love. And this happens in our families. It happens at school and at work. It even happens in church. And we need to remember that we've needed forgiveness as well. We need to be honest, because none of us is above the pull of humanity. It drags us down and it kicks us. And when that happens, we can be just as mean and ugly as the other guy if we're not careful. And then the fourth thing is to verbalize your forgiveness. Say, I forgive you. Actually say it. The spoken words of forgiveness and grace are very therapeutic to the person who has offended us. It's healthy for them to hear it, no matter how small the offense. And when you say it, that removes any doubt that you have forgiven them. Stuart Briscoe wrote a story about a woman, or told about a woman who came to a pastor's office who was very distressed. She had just a few days earlier committed her heart to the Lord, but she had something that was troubling her. And she told this unpleasant story about an affair that she had had with one of her husband's friends, and she insisted that the pastor know, and she insisted that her husband know, but she wanted the pastor to tell him. And so after some discussion, the pastor called the man and invited him to come to his office. She blurted it all out, and the man's response was remarkable. He turned to his tearful and fearful wife and said, "Honey, I love you. I forgive you. Let's make a new start." Now, many things had to be worked out, and many hurts had to be healed, but his response of forgiveness became the basis for new joy and new life for that couple. And this was made possible because he remembered that there were times in his own life that he needed to be forgiven. See, our typical response is to do all the wrong things. We try silence, or we try resentment, or holding a grudge, or indifference, or even plotting to get back at that person. And the trouble is, none of that pleases God, and it doesn't work. It doesn't solve the problem. But forgiveness does. So cultivating our spirit of forgiveness is a very real problem that we all have to deal with. We all have to deal with it. We need it in our family relationships, in our work and school relationships, and certainly in our church relationships. And we need to put our words into action and be people of forgiveness.